So for the people who don't know what FOV is, it basically gives you more vertical and horizontal vision. It, however, comes at the cost of squished center vision, so targets in the center of your screen look farther than where they actually are. Naturally, the first thing you do in every game is max the FOV slider. This is the only game where that's not the case for many people. I've been playing on 50 for over 2 years now, and obviously the gameplay speaks for itself, but I also did make that decision 2 years ago, and a lot of my perception on things have changed since then. So I decided to do another test where I play with 70 FOV for around 2 to 3 days and do a thorough analysis on it. Now let's get on to it. By far the biggest advantage to 70 FOV is that your view whenever you aim is also bigger. Compare this to 50 FOV where you will lose sight of the target if they roll to the side of you, requiring you to turn your mouse blindly to track them. You see that clearly here where someone aiming at me is in my blind spot with 50 FOV, but clearly visible with 70 FOV. I found that it was a pretty big advantage in duels where your opponent is very mobile and tries to trick you. It's much easier to do 180s and track your target on 70 FOV versus 50 FOV. This is especially telling in bow versus bow, where if you fight players who know how to turn their dodges, it becomes a bit hard to track them with low FOV, but it's much easier on high FOV. But it does come at a cost. Once your opponent gets a little farther, it's much harder to hit them. Just compare the size difference between me on a Dorian 70 FOV screen versus a Dorian on my 50 FOV screen. We both do an evade shot at the same exact time, but mine is much easier to hit because he's huge on my screen. And ultimately that's what happens. But then look what happens whenever he's in my face. I completely lose sight of him and have to turn my camera while he doesn't have to do that nearly as dramatic. So this higher FOV is pretty much only useful for fights where a ranged player is constantly getting right in your face. Outside of duels, you obviously have more freedom with your zoom, so if you're getting chased, you can fully zoom out and kite better. Additionally, stuff like the heavy pen shot cancel for some reason seems easier to hit and track. I often have a problem where I hit the heavy and miss the pen shot, but that seems to not happen as much here. I don't really have an explanation for this besides it simply feeling smoother on 70 versus 50. Also, just the act of letting go of the aim button and doing the big roll seems a lot smoother. There's no huge zoom in and out that disorients you and makes you flick your mouse to adjust for your aim. Overall in OPR, it feels like if you're pub stomping, higher FOV does feel better. But when you're fighting decent players, you start to feel the negative effects of it a lot more, such as the distorted depth perception, which is the main disadvantage of 70 FOV I want to talk about. Your depth perception against melee players is pretty much ruined. You look like you're far enough and BAM! They still hit you. The game just doesn't feel as natural. In 50 FOV, you know whether or not you're far enough to get hit by a reap. It's much harder to do that on 70 when they appear farther or closer to you depending on the angle you're looking at them with. And if you're trying to hit those long range shots, you're going to struggle a lot more. I'm not saying it's impossible, but in general, if a 50 FOV bow is fighting a 70 FOV bow from more than 30 meters away, the 50 bow should always win. This especially applies to high DPI or sensitivity players. I play on 3000 DPI, which is pretty unheard of, so having to make more precise aim adjustments to account for smaller targets is simply harder. I know we all like to think we have perfect aim, but we don't. You're making the game harder for yourself for no reason. But at the end of the day, that's not even the main deal breaker. The one thing I can say that is a deal breaker is that 1vx felt 10 times harder than what it actually was supposed to be. I was struggling to 1v2 and Kai players that I can normally 1v5 on a bad day. Maybe if I played 70 FOV back at launch, I would be used to it by now, but I don't think that's salvageable now. For any normal scenario, I'm definitely leaning towards staying at 50. In general, you can't really see people's micro movements anymore the same way you can see them on 50. I'm not saying they're unpredictable, but it was definitely harder in comparison. You almost feel like you're moving way faster than you actually are on 70. When multiple people charge you, it feels much scarier than it should be because of that. It also felt like it was way harder to chase people at 70 compared to 50, just a lose-lose scenario in both situations. Honestly, a little off topic, but it makes a lot of sense why melee players complain about range so much. Most of them rock 70 FOV on their screen and it looks like the range player is halfway across the map. Meanwhile, they're pretty much right next to them. I'm not saying this is the only reason they're struggling to kill range players, but there's definitely a correlation. My SNS Spear gameplay, for example, is just on zoomed out 50 FOV, and it's definitely way above average given how I still see people with the same build losing to B tier bows. I tried 70 and all I can say is all your complaints make sense now, and you're biting yourself in the foot by continuing to play at 70 knowing this information. Also, I was going to use this as an example of how hard it is to shoot far with targets with 70 FOV, but I ended up aimbotting this guy instead. But anyways, fuck him in particular. Never take the opinion of someone who can't dodge shots from 50 meters away seriously. Like, all you have to do is this. And yet so many people would rather choose the easy route and complain. Takes you a couple seconds to learn this and implement it in your fighting style. Takes you minutes and hours to write posts on the forums or the Discord about how broken ranged is. Anyway, so what's my conclusion? I almost feel like if you have a big screen, I'm talking bigger than 27 inches, you can max out your FOV and get the best of both worlds with no care in the world. You can even squish your horizontal resolution so that targets are bigger or fatter in this case. Again, the main point of this FOV thing is the better bow aim. Everything else outside of it is nearly a con. I feel like 70 FOV is very situational for very specific duels, and at that point you might as well manually switch to 70 just for that duel, and then use 50 for everything else. I'm a firm believer in don't try to fix something that's not broken. I play at 50 and have no problems with anything regarding PvP. The only problem I do have is keeping track of very, very specific people in duels, and 70 FOV seems to solve that, but it does come with the cost that I mentioned before, so it's not even a win-win situation. Ultimately, I'm keen on my decision to not switch to 70, but that doesn't mean I'll play on 50. I'm still experimenting with different values such as 55 and 60, and I'm even debating slowly raising my FOV by 1 every week and eventually capping it around 55 to 60. The only thing that's out of the question is 65 to 70 for me. Anyways, just want to say thank you for watching. I appreciate all the subs I've been getting recently, and I'm really excited to make more post-expansion content for you guys. I also have some exciting news about another game that I can't share yet, but I still want to thank all of you because I would have never gotten the opportunity if it wasn't for you guys. But yeah, goodbye, and I'll see you all in the next video.